Okay, so let's continue where we left off last week. We're in the middle of the 5th Mishnah of the 5th chapter. And this is the 10 miracles that happened in the Beis HaMikdash. We did an introduction last week, and then we focused on the first of the 10 miracles, which is that no woman ever miscarried, and that's as far as we got. And I thought last week that we were actually going to get through half the Mishnah, and then we would do the other half this week. Didn't quite work out that way, so we got through one of the 10 last week. Don't worry, it's not a 10-week series. The idea is obviously today to get through a few more of those miracles, and the first two are really an extension of each other, so we can put them together. When I say the first two of today's, it's miracle 2 and miracle 3. So that's the miracle that lo yisriach basar hakodesh me'olam, that the meat of the korbanos never went rotten, ever, in almost 1,000 years of sacrificial, avoida. It never happened, never went off. So that's a huge miracle. And that's directly related to the next one, v'lo nimtza zvuv beveis hamitbochayim, that they never saw a fly in the slaughtering area, which of course was, as you can imagine, was full of animals and blood and meat and whatever the case is. And not to have a fly was a really big deal. And obviously the two are connected to each other because the flies would have been attracted to the decay. So if there's no decay, there's no flies. Now, everybody, I've got to be careful what I say, because things get out. But everybody living in this country spends a certain amount of their time thinking, perhaps we should be living in another country. Something that happens a lot. And recently, and it's happened every few months or years or whatever, but recently there was a very public statement by a particular organization in Australia about how South African Jews should come to Australia. So I'll tell you one thing about them. It's not here to say, go here, go there, live here, go there. But one thing you have to know about Australia, they have another type of fly. They have another kind of fly. Not only that, those flies, they don't leave. Once they find you, they don't leave. So there's nothing more annoying, if you think about it, than having something buzzing around your head. Like a fly. It's incredibly annoying. Yesterday, I had to be at the cemetery, unfortunately. I'm standing there speaking, and there's this fly right here. And I'm trying to speak and obviously keep a little bit of a dignified pose. It's a very sad time for the family. And I've got this fly that keeps on the left, like at my left ear, just buzzing around. So it's very distracting. Having flies around is very distracting, besides anything else. I'm not going to get into how, whether you feel that flies are or are not clean or hygienic or whatever. Just simply distracting. Now you have Kohanim who are working under tremendous pressure in the Beis HaMikdash. And they've got to process all kinds of korbanos with all the right intentions. If they get distracted from their thought process, they could be the reason that somebody's offering is disqualified. So they really have to be focused. And to have a whole lot of flies buzzing around their heads, besides the fact that they might be swatting the flies and who knows, but it could distract them from what they had to do. So for that reason, there's this miracle that happens in the Beis HaMikdash that despite the fact that there's meat and there's blood and who knows what, there are no flies, so that the Kohanim should not be distracted from what they need to do. It's very interesting. The Gemara tells us, Yetzer hara doimeh lizvuv. You ever heard this Gemara? The Yetzer hara is compared to a fly, hayoshev al miftachei halev, which sits at the valves of the heart, waiting for an opening to be able to get in, which is basically what flies do. If you think about it, they buzz around waiting until you're not watching or you're not shooing them away, and then they land and they help themselves to the food. So the implication of no flies is not just simply that there's no flies around. The implication is that there's no distraction, there's no Yetzer hara around, and there's a very good message in this. The message is that if the meat of the korbanos, which obviously at the point that it's already processed and it's already meat, is no longer a living being, and yet Hashem makes a miracle to preserve it and not allow it to decay, kal v'chomer, how much more so we, people, living, dynamic people, if we make ourselves kodesh, if we designate ourselves for holy activities, to do what Hashem wants, then Hashem will, number one, protect us from the flies, protect us from the Yetzer Hara. Number two, preserve us that we won't, chas v'shalom, degrade. So that's the personal message that we're supposed to take out of this. Not just, oh wow, in the Beis HaMikdash, amazing things happened, but it's really a lesson for ourselves. Just to sidetrack for 1 second, but to the point. So when Yosef's brothers wanted to get rid of him, and they had various ideas of how to do so. So what was plan A? Plan A was kill him outright. Okay, Reuven had an issue with this, and he says, we shouldn't kill him, and let's come up with another plan. Okay, what's plan B? Plan B is throw him in a pit. So what does the Torah tell us? V'haboir reik, the pit was empty. Ein boi mayim, and it didn't have water. Might have to tell me that. If it's empty, obviously it doesn't have water, it's empty. Says Rashi, what it's telling us is mayim ein boi. A bor is typically a reservoir that is used to collect water. So if it's empty, it means it's empty of the thing that's normally supposed to be in it, which is water, but there's an implication that there was something else. Mayim ein boi, it didn't have water in it. Nechoshim v'akravim yesh boi. Instead, it had snakes and scorpions. Really nice place to hang out. So what's the lesson for us? The lesson is, everybody knows this, Mayim, water, is the metaphor for Torah. The bor represents the mind. V'haboir reik, there's no such thing as an empty mind. It's not possible. There'll always be something to fill the mind. V'haboir reik ein boi mayim. If the mind is empty of water, i.e. of Torah, then what will fill it? Nechoshim v'akravim. Inappropriate thoughts. Snakes and scorpions, which we're still going to learn about later in the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah later talks about snakes and scorpions, so we'll identify what these inappropriate thoughts are. But it's the same principle over here. If we're dedicated to do what Hashem wants, like the Kohanim were on the clock. They were under a lot of pressure. There was a lot to do and a lot of focus. If you're so immersed in doing what Hashem wants, there's no room for flies. There's no room for nonsense. And so if you think about it, the objective of Judaism, I don't know if you've noticed this, but the objective of Judaism is to keep us so busy, we don't have time to do anything wrong. What do I mean so busy? Even when we tie our laces in the morning, there's a halacha about that. There's a management of Judaism for everything. We're supposed to be conscious in every moment of our day, so we don't have time to do other things. If we're empty, that's when the tzoros begin. So that's possibly what we could take out of this first set of miracles we're learning about today, the lack of decay and the lack of flies. From that we jump to a very different scenario, and that is lo ira keri la Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim, that the Kohen Gadol on the night of Yom Kippur never experienced a bodily emission that would make him impure. Now there's a very interesting question about this practically, and that is, if you read the Mishnah in Yuma, it tells us they kept him up the whole night. So it's not like he was sleeping, at which time, a person might not be able to control their bodily functions. He was awake. He was learning Torah the whole night. That's what they used to do. And they had a whole team of young Kohanim who were around, to snap their fingers at him and keep him awake and make him walk up and down on the cold floors just to stay focused. So what's the message? What's the message of this piece?
We need to just fill ourselves with Torah and good
right?
works and holiness.
That's the message from the first two miracles. What's the message over here? So did you know, in case of emergency, like I once went many years ago to somebody's house back in the days when smoking was considered socially acceptable, and they had on their wall, they had a framed cigarette in case of emergency. In case of emergency, break glass. So in the Beis HaMikdash, I don't think he was kept in a glass case, but on Yom Kippur, in case of emergency, there was a standby Kohen Gadol. In case of emergency. What's the emergency that could happen? So it's very interesting because, the Mishnah in Yuma has a very interesting debate about whether the Kohen Gadol also had to have a standby wife. Because in order to be the Kohen Gadol, the man had to be married. The Torah says it clearly. V'chiper ba'adoi uva'ad beisoi. He had to atone for himself and for his family. And the Gemara says, beisoi zoi ishtoi. A person's home is their wife. So if he didn't have a wife, he would be disqualified as a Kohen Gadol. So there's a debate in the Mishnah, should there be a standby wife in case the wife dies on Yom Kippur? That he should have another wife. And the Gemara concludes, Im kain ein ledavar soif. We don't get involved in that kind of role play or scenario play, because then there's no end. What if that wife dies? So we don't insist on that. But a standby Kohen Gadol we do. Because what could disqualify the Kohen Gadol is not necessarily that he dies, it could be that he becomes impure. He becomes impure, right? He fell asleep, he had an incident, and now he's impure. So why does Hashem do a miracle to make sure that that never happens? We have a backup plan. It's not a big deal. Everybody goes to sleep on the eve of Yom Kippur. They come the next morning. There's another Kohen Gadol. What's the big deal? Everything continues as planned. What's the big deal? The dignity of the Kohen Gadol. Picture the scene. Imagine for one moment. The eve of Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol is there with his whole entourage and the whole, excitement of going into Yom Kippur. And everybody arrives at the Beis HaMikdash the next morning and there's another guy. What happened to the first guy? No, unfortunately, last night he had an incident. Can you imagine what that does to his dignity? So therefore, Hashem makes a miracle to protect the dignity of the Kohen Gadol. What's the lesson for us? It's self-evident, right? The lesson is incredible. It's that important. If Hashem is willing to change the rules of nature, the Mishnah calls it a miracle, to protect the dignity of a person who may be humiliated publicly, then we don't necessarily have to change the laws of nature to protect somebody else's dignity. We just have to change the way we talk or change the way we treat people to protect people's dignity. But that shows us how important it is. It's such a critical part of being Jewish to protect somebody's dignity. And I'm sure that if you thought for 30 seconds, you could come up with half a dozen stories that we're familiar with from either the Tanakh or the Gemara about people who did crazy things to protect other people's dignity. That's how important it is. And that's really something that we should focus on at all times. You know the famous story of Mar Ukva and his wife. Remember the story? He used to go give tzedakah anonymously. And then one day somebody was waiting for them, always wanted to see who the benefactor was, and they jumped into one of those big ovens, the big cholent ovens that they used to have in every city, to rather than to embarrass the person by knowing that such a great rabbi was helping them out, right?
She allowed Leah.
Rochel, right? Rochel allowed Leah to get married. Tamar didn't say Yehuda is the one who made her pregnant. Said, leave it to him to decide if he's going to acknowledge, etc., right? There are so many examples of this, because preserving somebody else's dignity is an incredibly important thing. And I recently heard, and I wish I remembered right now who I heard it from, but I recently heard an individual, a well-known Torah scholar of today's time, I can't remember now who it was, saying that there are certain things in Judaism that are minhagim, but the concept of preserving somebody else's dignity is from the Torah. So sometimes you've got to be willing to let the minhag go to preserve the dignity of the person, because one is a Torah obligation, right? Something to think about. It's like the joke they always make about the person who arrives at a wedding and is really, really frum. So he wants to know who's the mashgiach. This would never happen, right? Arrives and who's the mashgiach? Finds out who the mashgiach is, decides that he's not sure if he could trust the mashgiach. So when the salad comes, figures he has to just check the letters himself to make sure it's okay. The problem is, if you've ever been to a wedding, the lighting is not very conducive to seeing, checking letters. So he's sitting there at his table, in the ambient lighting, he can't see if there's anything on the chart. So where's their light? The videographer's always got a good light. So everybody's sitting at the main table. The videographer has his light on the newlywed couple, and this guy comes and he stands there under the light of the videographer checking his letters, right? So now you ask yourself, is that considered frum? That's terrible, right? That's this horrible humiliation of the family. Not that it's a bit of an exaggerated story, but you get the picture. So Hashem is willing to do a miracle in order to preserve the dignity of people. I'll tell you a radical version of that. A radical version. How did Yitzchak go blind towards the end of his life? Anybody know? How did he go blind towards the end of his life? Or why? Let's put it that way. Why did Yitzchak go blind towards the end? Because what? Because Esav's wives had a shtickle incense going on in the compound. You can assume they lived in a compound. And they had their idolatrous incense that they used to bring. And Yitzchak was an incredibly sensitive person, spiritually sensitive. So their incense blinded his eyes. Right? That's one opinion. What's the other opinion?
That he wouldn't see that it was being tricked.
The other opinion is that he shouldn't see that it's Yaakov and not Esav. That Esav should not get the brachas. So let's understand this for a second, right? The fact that Yitzchak's eyes were affected by the smoke. Okay? Nebuch, unfortunately. The wrong people were in his environment and he was affected. You could be the nicest person on earth, but if the person next to you is a chain smoker, you might get second-degree smoke. That's what happens. But the concept, the suggestion of Chazal, that Yitzchak went blind so that Yaakov should get the brachas, who made him blind according to that opinion? Who made him blind? Hashem made him blind. So let me ask a question. If Hashem wants the brachas to go to Yaakov instead of to Esav, why make Yitzchak blind for another, how long was he still going to live? Another half a century or something like that, right? So if all those years are going to be blind, why doesn't Hashem just come down from heaven, whisper in Yitzchak's ear and say, Esav's not who you think he is. He doesn't deserve the brachas. Elamai, was it teach you? That's how important it is to preserve somebody else's dignity. How's that for a thought? That Hashem is willing to take a tzaddik who can handle it, because he's Yitzchak. Yitzchak is the kind of tzaddik who can handle the harshest things. I mean, he stretched out his neck at the Akedah, Rather, he should experience the challenge of blindness than Hashem should ruin the dignity of Esav, who's not a good guy, by the way. How's that for a thought? So,
it's not only the dignity of Esav, but also the dignity of Yitzchak, because he would be seen embarrassed almost that he thought Esav was...
You're saying Yitzchak's dignity would have also been undermined because all the years he had been in favor of Esav. Okay, that's a... 100%. It's a good. That's a valid point. Let's just bear in mind that when the story plays out with the blessings, at that point he says Gam Baruch Yeh. He acknowledges that actually he had seen it all wrong. But fair enough. It's easier to come to that realization of one's own accord than to have Hashem say, "Oops, you misread the situation." Okay, fair enough. Absolutely. Okay, so that's a valuable lesson for us, right? Preserving dignity of people. If Hashem will do a miracle for it, we could also put in a little bit of effort. What's the next thing we have on the list? That there were 3 different offerings that were brought on an annual basis that all required grain. Now, this is dafka the ones that were brought on an annual basis. There were mincha offerings that were brought regularly through the course of the year, and mincha offerings also come from flour. But what's unique about these is the omer offering is, as we learned last week, that's what permits us to use the grains of the new season. So until the Omer offering is brought on the second day of Pesach, we're not permitted to use Chadash. We're not permitted to use the grains of the new season. The Shtei HaLechem, the 2 breads that were brought on Shavuos, so they also are part of allowing us to use the new grains for the mincha offerings during the course of the year. Up until Shavuos, you use old grain, Yoshan, for the mincha offerings for the year. And the lechem haponim, which is the 12 loaves that were brought every single Shabbos, so they were cycled on a weekly basis, meaning each Shabbos they'd put new loaves on, and they'd take the old loaves off and give it to the Kohanim who were knocking off duty, because the Kohanim worked on 24 shifts of 1 week each. Now, in all 3 of these cases, if something goes wrong, people are affected. So if something goes wrong with the Omer offering, if we arrive over there and we want to bring the Omer offering, oops, there's a psul, something disqualifies it, the entire nation now has a major issue because they can't eat the new products. And the same thing with the Shtei HaLechem. And the Lechem HaPonim pretty much affects the Kohanim. So if you find that the Lechem HaPonim was disqualified, there's a whole shift of Kohanim who lose out on their bread for the week. So the message over here is that Hashem creates miracles in order to make our lives so to speak, workable or even enjoyable in the case of the Kohanim. It's not like they have no other food. So in order that it should be enjoyable. There's also a great mitzvah over here. Could they not just, okay, fine, so the Omer didn't work today, so we'll bring the Omer tomorrow. What's the big deal? Lechem Aponim is a little bit more tricky because it's a Shabbos thing. You can't just produce a new one on Shabbos. It has to be prepared before Shabbos and brought on Shabbos. That's more tricky. And Shtei HaLechem you could also argue because it's Yom Tov, right? But the Omer is not Yom Tov. It's Chol HaMoed already. It's the second day. So what's the issue over here?
Other people would have cooked it already or baked with their...
People might have relied on it, so that's for sure a practical issue. There's another issue as well. We have a principle. In fact, it's what we just read in the parasha 2 weeks ago. And that is Ushmartem es hamatzos, that you have to guard the matzos. This is where we get into the whole issue of Shmura Matzah. And with it, the price hikes that are associated with Shmura Matzah. So Shmartem es hamatzos, you have to make sure that you watch the matzos, and that's right from the time that it's grain. You've got to watch it to make sure that it doesn't come in touch with water, so it doesn't become chometz, right? So the Gemara says, very interesting, Ushmartem es hamatzos, the Torah is written without vowels, so you could read it as Ushmartem es hamitzvos. You have to guard the mitzvos. And then the expression the Gemara uses is mitzvah haba liyadoi al tachmitzeno. If a mitzvah comes your way, don't delay it. But the word it uses is don't allow it to become chometz. How does something become chometz? You delay it. You don't work with it. A time period goes by that nobody's working with the dough, and then it becomes chometz. Right? The famous 18-minute window. So mitzvah haba liyadoi, when a mitzvah comes your way, al tachmitzena, don't delay it. That's what Hashem's showing us over here. Nature is such that when you're dealing with grain, you have to expect sometimes there's going to be psul. Sometimes you're going to find something creeping inside. Sometimes you're going to find that it's gone a little bit ransacked. That's what happens. So Hashem does a miracle to show us how important it is not to delay a mitzvah. So in all the years that the Beis Hamikdash operates, they never once delay the mitzvah for what would have been a purely natural cause. The lesson for us is, if we are in control, obviously if something is not in our control, it's not in our control, but if we are in control, and a mitzvah comes our way, al tachmitzena, we dare not allow it to, so to speak, rise or become leaven or become chometz, which obviously implies that it's totally inappropriate.
So actually everything is teaching us, every lesson that we're learning here about the miracles there, apply to us of how we must be observant of ourselves and do our thing.
Correct, because remember this is Pirkei Avos. Pirkei Avos is not a book of stories, and it's not a book of halacha. It's a book of personal conduct. So if we're reading about a miracle, the miracle is amazing and it blows us away, but more importantly, it is a lesson for us. Which is why the next one is a very important one that needs a lot of attention. What's the next miracle that happened? Oimdim tzfufin umishtachavim revachim. Okay, let's translate that. One word at a time. Oimdim. How do you translate that?
Standing.
Standing in the plural, right? So they were standing tzfufim. Squashed, right? Yes? Umishtachavim. And they bowed. Revachim. What's revachim?
Space.
With space. So picture the scene. Picture the scene. It's difficult for us to picture because, Baruch Hashem, we have space. We live in South Africa. We have space. We don't understand the concept of tzfufim in our communities. Our shuls, Baruch Hashem, are large. Everybody has place. You can even get a name tag on your place. Nobody's allowed to sit there, right? You go to other parts of the world and you see what tzfufim is. They have these tiny little shuls where there's no space to breathe. People get packed in. Even if you go, for example, on a big yontiv to the kotel, it's tzfufim. People are, packed in. Mishtachavim, when you bow down, revachim. When did you bow down? On Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, right? On Yom Kippur, when the Kohen Gadol would say Hashem's name, everybody would bow down on the floor. What did you do when you bowed down on the floor on Yom Kippur? What happened next? So when we do it in Shul, we say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus Olam Vod, and we say that that's what they said at that time. Why? Because they had heard Hashem's name. So in hearing Hashem's name, their response was, we bless Hashem's name. So that's what they're doing down on the floor, right? What else did they do? They spread, yeah, that's right, they prostrated themselves, and they spread out their arms in front of them. They literally laid down on the floor. And what they did while they were prostrated on the floor is they said a personal confession. Now, Oimdim Tzfufim, if everybody's squashed, that means that everybody could technically hear everybody else's personal confession. So the miracle is again a miracle of personal dignity. When it comes time to bow down, there's enough space that you don't hear what the next person is saying. Because remember, the Rambam tells us in Hilchos Teshuvah that in order for a person to fulfill the mitzvah of Teshuvah, you have to verbalize. You actually have to say the confession aloud. It's not good enough just to think it. You actually have to say it. And the Gemara, a very interesting Gemara, tells us that a person who says their confession loud enough for others to hear, that's inappropriate. So now you're in a bit of a jam, you know. What are you supposed to do? You have to confess, and you're supposed to verbalize. Nobody else is supposed to hear. So Hashem makes a miracle. Mishtachavim revochim. That you could find more than enough space when you bowed down. Now, is anybody familiar with any other word in Hebrew, more specifically in Talmudic Hebrew, that is related to the word tzefufim? Related. It's not identical. Related to the word tzefufim. Anybody? So in various places throughout the Mishnah, we talk about something that is tzof. Tzof means to float. So for example, what happens if a person, remember that the poor are supposed to collect various types of parts of the field, leket, shichacha, peah. So there's a very interesting halachic question. In order to collect leket, what's leket? Leket are the pieces that fall down while the farmer is collecting the bundles, the sheaves. Any individual stalks that fall to the ground, the farmer has to leave. And then afterwards, the poor people come and they collect them. The Torah is very clear that leket has to be on the ground in order for the poor person to collect it. The same applies to shichacha. Shichacha means as the person's making their sheaves, if they forget some wheat behind them, even if it's a full bundle of wheat, they're not allowed to go back. They have to leave it there. There also, the Torah says, "V'shachachta omer bas sodeh." It's got to be in the field. It's got to be on the ground. So now, here's the halachic question. What if half the field's been harvested, half hasn't, and now there's a few stalks that are sitting on top of the stalks that are still growing? Is the poor person entitled to take them? That is called tzof. It's floating. It's not on the ground. Is it considered something that a person is allowed to take? Here's another example. Okay? If you read, and by the way, the Gemara associates these two examples. I'm not just randomly pulling them together. The Gemara associates these two examples in determining the law of tzof. So what happens if, God forbid, we find a John Doe murdered on the road between two cities? So what do? We measure which city is the closest, and the elders of that city have to be accompanied by members of the Sanhedrin Yerushalayim to do what is called the Egla Arufa cleansing process. There the Torah says specifically, if we find the murdered person on the ground, ask the Gemara, what if he's tzof? What if he's not on the ground? What if he's on whatever it might be? What if he's on another person? Maybe two people who were killed. The one is sitting on top of the other. It's not on the ground. So there's this principle. Okay, this is not a halacha shir, and it's not a Gemara shir, so we're not going to go into what the halacha is. I'm just using this to illustrate to you that the word tzof also means to float. And there are various other halachic implications as well. If something floats from one person's field to another person's field, the point I'm making is the word tzof appears very often in Mishnah language as something that floats. Based on that, this concept of oimdim tzefufin, that everybody stood crushed together, actually implies that people floated. What does it mean that people floated? I'll tell you a story. It's a real story that really happened to me. So in 1987, I won a trip to go to New York to spend the entire month of Tishrei. We got there before Rosh Hashanah and we left after Simchas Torah in New York together with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I'd never experienced such a thing, obviously, in my life, and I never dreamt of having it. And there we went. Before we went, we sat down with one of the rabbis here, and he wrote us a very clear itinerary of what we should expect. This is when the Rebbe will address the public. This is when you should be in that place and whatever. So we had this very clear itinerary. One of the things on the itinerary said as follows. On the first night of Sukkot, straight after davening, the Rebbe will speak in shul. And you need to be there, obviously, for that. And then as soon as he's finished speaking, anybody who's from overseas, who's come in special from out of New York, who's come in specially for Yom Tov, the Rebbe will give another talk only to the guests in the sukkah. So you've got to time it that you can be there to hear the first talk, but be able to get out of the shul and get to the sukkah in time for the second talk, because it's Yom Tov and obviously there's no microphone. You need to be close enough that you should be able to hear. So I had this whole thing worked out. This is where I'm going to be and this is where I'm going to go, and I'm near the door, and like a whole thing. Anyhow, as soon as the first sikha, the first talk ended, I ran out of the shul with a few of my friends. We ran up to the sukkah, and the sukkah at that stage was just a big open area, obviously a sukkah, but there was no furniture except for one concrete bench that was fixed in the ground. And I figured, this is the perfect place to go. So I jump onto this concrete bench thinking now I've got the perfect view. It was probably like 4 meters away from where the Rebbe was going to stand. And within minutes the place packed, full of people, full like you cannot believe. And before I realized what's going on, my arms are pinned at my sides. Could not get my arms out. There was such a crush of people, I couldn't get my arms out. And it started to get a little bit hot, and my glasses started to slide. And I'm trying all these different methods, to keep my glasses on. And eventually, they slipped right off, down below. And there's hundreds of people in my immediate vicinity. I thought, that's the end of my glasses. As that happened, as they slipped off, that's when the Rebbe arrived. I could hear perfectly. I couldn't see a thing, even though it was just a few meters away. And throughout that talk, there was, I don't know if you've ever been in such a crush of people, but people don't stay still. So there's constant movement. So every once in a while, I would go off the bench. But I never fell. It was such a crush of people. So I went off the bench, feet in the air, and then there would be a push back, and I'd be back on the bench, and off the bench. And that is tzvufin. That's what we're describing over here in the Beis HaMikdash. Oimdim tzvufin means when there's such a crush of people, that's what happens. People get literally lifted off their feet, and they float with the movement of the crowd. That's what he's describing. What's the deeper lesson over here? There's got to be a deeper lesson. Besides the fact that, yes, Hashem obviously wants people to have the dignity of being able to make the confession without somebody else hearing. But there's got to be something far deeper over here, right?
I think the fact is that everybody's allowing another person their privacy, their space. There's a generosity.
Okay, so here's the thing. The thing is that we could have all the great intention in the world. Physical space is still physical space. And again, if I go back to that period of time, or other times that I had the opportunity to be in 770, which is the Rebbe Shul, you could be the nicest person in the world. If there's no space, there's no space. You could be as considerate as you want of the next person, but if there is no physical place that you could open up to allow them to just breathe a little bit, you can't do it. So what's the message? The message is that there are two ways in which people operate, the typical and the aspirational. The typical way that people operate is oimdim. Oimdim. I'm standing here. I'm standing here. This is me. This is my space. This is my position. This is my outlook. This is my perspective. When a person stands, they stand with a certain sense of firmness and a certain sense of self. Oimdim. If a person stands with that immutable or that inflexible perspective on life, tzfufim, life will always feel like there's terrible pressure and that you're always being somehow compressed or somehow limited or somehow hurt. A story of a chassid of the third Rebbe of Chabad, the Tzemach Tzedek, who came to him and he had a complaint. He said, every time I walk into the base medrash, the way that people treat me, I feel like they always trample all over me. Every time I walk into the base medrash. The Tzemach Tzedek said to him, maybe that's because you spread yourself throughout the whole base medrash every time you walk in. In other words, when a person has that sense of self, that sense of ego, then we feel like everybody's stepping on us. Then we feel like life is always tzufufim. Nobody listens to me, nobody appreciates me, nobody considers me, and life is a very uncomfortable journey. Now I'll tell you the truth, let's go back to that example that I was giving you when you have this crush of people in a confined space. I'll tell you the only other place that I ever felt it to that extent was Lag BaOmer at Meron. So if you've ever been to Meron and Lag BaOmer, the crush of people is incredible. When you get inside to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's grave, you honestly, let's be honest, it doesn't make any sense what goes on over there. Unfortunately, we know what happened, right? The crush of people. But what's interesting about it is, you get two types of people in the crowd. You get the person in the crowd who feels that they have to stand their ground, and those are the people who come out battered and bruised. You have the person who's just like, they go with the flow. They go with the flow, and they get shafted from here to there and whatever, and they come out okay. It's actually a statistic about chas v'shalom car accidents, that people who are asleep at the time of impact report less injury than people who are awake. Because when a person is awake and they anticipate impact, the whole body tenses up, and because of that tension, it's like a rigid experience. The impact is rigid, so the person, God forbid, has worse injuries. Whereas the person who's asleep has no idea of what's coming, so they're in a relaxed state, and then they actually do better. The Gemara talks about this. The Gemara says a person should always be flexible like a reed and not stiff. Oh, it's Tu B'Shvat. Perfect time to talk about it. And not stiff like a cedar tree. So, for example, you go to those parts of the world where they have hurricanes, you always see the palm trees have this incredible ability to move. They're incredibly flexible, so they don't get broken. Over here, every time we have a little bit of a thunderstorm, there's trees all over the place. Because the trees we have here are more rigid trees. Interesting. That's another Gemara, by the way. It talks about the whole concept of the palm tree and how it moves. So that's the message. Oimdim. As long as a person stands with a sense of self and their needs, tzfufim, life is always going to be difficult. Everybody else is going to be in our way. Mishtachavim. When a person is willing to bend, a person is willing to be flexible, a person is willing to bow, revochim, then there is so much space in life. There is so much breathing room. There is so much opportunity. And we get to choose. And we can be the oimdim people or the mishtachavim people. But it goes a layer deeper than that as well. Because, mishtachavim is all very good, but we also know that if a person bows down to the wrong thing, that's called avodah zarah. You can't just say, I'm bowing, because that's really important, to be able to be flexible and to be able to compromise and whatever the case is. Not that simple. You bow to the wrong thing. The Rambam says this really clearly, that when it comes to avodah zarah, if there's a particular behavior that is unique to that particular avodah zarah, then if we follow that behavior, it's a problem. Even if we think that it's a way to disgrace the avodah zarah. So like Markulis, where they used to throw stones at the avodah zarah. So a Jewish person comes along and thinks, I'm also going to stone the avodah zarah, right? I'll show that the Rambam says that would be a problem because that's how they serve it. But it doesn't matter which avodah zarah it is. If you mishtachave, if you bow to an avodah zarah, that's always problematic, regardless of whether that's the way to serve it or not. So it's not good enough just to say mishtachavim. Not that simple. What happens when we're mishtachavim, when we bow down? So in the Beis HaMikdash, the only place on earth that a Jewish person is allowed to bow down, and not only allowed, but supposed to bow down completely flat. When we daven in shul, we just bow our heads. And when we daven on Yom Kippur, then we go down and we symbolically put our head to the floor, but we don't spread ourselves out. What happens when a person spreads out? Like flat on the floor. You know who does this, by the way?
Muslims.
Children having tantrums. They spread themselves out flat on the floor. So what happens? No, think about it. I'm not being not being facetious. What happens when a person lies down on the floor is we undermine what makes humans unique. The uniqueness of a human is that our posture represents the spiritual makeup of who we are. Animals are not that way. So an animal's posture is generally horizontal, and a human's posture is specifically vertical, and that's relevant because in the functioning of a human being, or in the functioning of any being for that matter, we speak about 3 levels of process. Roish, Guf, Regel. Roish is the whole intellectual experience. Guf is the entire character or emotional experience. Regel is how we engage with the world in practical terms. Now that's how a human being is supposed to work. First the mind. First we appreciate the value in something objectively. Then we allow ourselves to become emotionally attached to it subjectively. And then we translate it into action. That's a healthy human being. What's an unhealthy human being? An impulsive human being. So that's when the heart leads. I'm not talking about the heart as in intuition or those things. Heart as an impulsive leads, and then the brain justifies. That's very unhealthy. That's an animal. An animal is an instinctive creature. The instinct leads, and then it crafts a way to actually fulfill what the instinct needs. So what defines a human is oimdim, actually. That's actually what makes it, that's our greatness, is oimdim. The fact that we're able to stand upright. The fact that our mind is able to guide the rest of us. That is our greatest asset. Except in Hashem's presence. When we're in Hashem's presence, we're in the Beis HaMikdash, then the appropriate thing is completely horizontal. That means my mind in this context is puny. We're talking about Hashem who is infinite. We're talking about Hashem who is absolute emes. Whether my mind gets it or doesn't is irrelevant. Whether my mind understands it or not is irrelevant. There's only one thing that's relevant in Hashem's space, and that is commitment, dedication. Bowing is a sign of submission. I submit my mind to Hashem. And in the Beis HaMikdash, we submit in the most extreme way. So every time we daven, we also bow our heads to remind ourselves to submit our intellect to Hashem. But in the Beis HaMikdash, which is a place of intense divine revelation, there we have to have intense surrender of self. Bittul. Correct. Complete surrender of self. And when we have complete surrender of self, then revachim. Then we realize that there's plenty of room for everyone. Because in our minds, there's a hierarchy. There are more important people and less important people. In our minds, there are certain things that should never happen. And when they happen, tzvufim, we feel like life is claustrophobic. But when we mishtachavim, when we acknowledge that Hashem is the ultimate truth, and Hashem is the ultimate good, and Hashem is the ultimate source, then revachim, then there's room for every person, and there's room for every situation. And it doesn't have to destroy me. It doesn't have to be tzifufim. It doesn't have to create pressure in my life. To the contrary, those things that when I was oimed, thinking on my terms, were the things that created the biggest stress and obstacles in my life, they become revachim. They become the things that open me up. And that's probably one of the greatest challenges in our lives, is to be able to accept Hashem's ultimate wisdom, authority, and goodness, so that the things that were the tzifufim things in our lives, the greatest source of our distress and of our pain, they themselves become the revachim, the things that give us the greatest insight, development as people, growth, and breathing, literally breathing space. So that's quite an important thing to try and keep in mind. You know, in the Beis HaMikdash, you experience it whether you like it or not. And in life, we're supposed to extract from the Beis HaMikdash and try and apply it in our lives. And there's a fair amount of work that we need to do in that realm, right? Fair amount of work. Okay, so we'll leave that there, and Mitzvah Hashem next week we'll finish off the other miracles of the Beis HaMikdash.